I want to welcome everybody to today's CREASE noon lecture. My name is Johannes von Moltke, and I'm the current director of CREASE here at the University of Michigan. I want to thank the Albanian American Student Organization here at Michigan for co-sponsoring this event, and a specific thanks to our student Aristea Kola for proposing this idea and connecting us to these three wonderful speakers. I'm really delighted that we have an opportunity, thanks to Zoom, to converse across the Atlantic between Ann Arbor and Tirana, and listen to three authors and scholars speak about Albanian literature. And I think the way we'll do this, each of them will speak for around 15 minutes. And I will introduce them as they come up so that you don't have to remember everything all the way through to the last one. I will begin by introducing to you Primo Shlaku, who was born in Shkodra, a town in the north of Albania of great cultural importance, which lasted until the time the communist regime was set up. His father was a theater director and his uncle a prominent translator of ancient Greek and Latin. Primo Shlaku studied Albanian language and literature at the State University of Tirana for several years. He taught in different schools and different levels of school in Tirana, as well as in different villages. Beginning in the late 80s, he taught at the University of Shkodra. Later, he taught Albanian and French in Greece, as well as Albanian at the University of Belgrade. In 2010, he received a doctorate in literary sciences, after which he has been teaching a history of aesthetical doctrines at the University of Fine Arts in Tirana. So you can see a broad and varied vita, and he has just completed a book that he's will tell us about on clandestine authorship during and after the communist regime. Welcome, Primo Shlaku.
Well found. We say well found to all the people that say welcome. I am very glad, and I thank very much the organizers of this activity. I'll be very short because we have no time to lose. I think I have to say two words briefly about what I am going to read to you today. There is a new book of mine, the newest, which in a fortnight will see the light of libraries. And it is a survey about the other literature, that means the clandestine, the underground literature, which was written in Albania during the dictatorship, and which then was published after the 90s when the regime fell. So I think that the problems of this book, which is ratherly thick, it was very difficult for me to compress and to find some outlines for presenting them to the public and to the audience of the Michigan University. I think people must. I thought that people must be interested about to know who were the writers that wrote for the regime, for the dictatorship, who were the others, the clandestine ones who wrote in silence and waited the time to come for publishing them, and which was the climate of creation in Albania during the dictatorship. So my book is entitled Another Literature, the small one, but a literature that had to win perhaps the victory of the future. This is a humble idea. Another literature. As commonly known, Albania experienced the most cruel and fierce dictatorship in Europe during the long period between 1945 and 1990. For almost half a century, democracy and human rights were repressed. Scholars and thinking people were considered enemies of the regime, so they were imprisoned and confined, or worse, obliged to work hard in mines, quarries, and swamps. The spiritual life in the country was dying slowly by slowly and by state project. The civil rights were restricted, and the art, especially the literature, were submitted to a severe censorship. After the changement of political system in the early 90s, in all the Eastern Europe, people spoke more and more about the dissidents and generally of the dissidents in the socialist countries. We heard of great writers who challenged the communist regimes in different countries of the Eastern Bloc, and we had all the time to admire their courage and spirit of determination during the period of the communist power. Obviously, we have been demanding ourselves whether there was a dissidence in Albania, whether the intellectual forces of the country could somehow resist by opposing a kind of dissidence to the regime. Many voices claimed that in Albania there were no dissidents because of the almost inexistent spaces to develop any activity which would go against the directives of the official thought and orientation. Even there was a serious striving to make clear that the official writers were the real and the only dissidents who, by hinting at pretended ambiguous ideas, had told things that shook the globe. So the official establishment of literature strove hard to deny any kind of dissidence, pretending that they were the only ones who fought it with soft manners, the regime and its methods, both its political and aesthetic standards. Slowly by slowly, until 1994, all the clandestine literary production went forth and began to be published. And the Albanian audience was proposed quite new names, unheard so far, that witnessed a new sensibility and moreover, a new direction of aesthetic orientation, always in strong connection with the Albanian pre-communist literature. Who were these writers who emerged almost from nowhere, becoming notorious with their non-voluminous writings, but with their courageous ideas and attitudes? Among them, we see, and we name Zev Zorba, Mohamed Ademi, Kasem Trebeshina, Trifon Gjajika, Havzi Nela, Wilson Bloshmi, Gens Leka, Sander Gera, Les Shlaku, and so on. We have to remember that 4 of the mentioned names above were executed by the regime. Gjajika, Bloshmi, and Leka have been shot dead, and Nela hung up in the middle of a square in the town of Kukës. We have to notice that the major part of those persons were from the northern regions of Albania, where the literary tradition was more powerful before the World War II. First of all, We must emphasize that the dissidence in the East Communist bloc has emerged in quite different conditions as those existing in Albania. During the Cold War, Communist Russia and her allies assured for themselves a kind of stability, and that perhaps permitted to those regimes to give up some liberties and to respect some items of the human rights. The communist system flattered itself that he was already a worldwide system with an excellent future, so the governments permitted some outlaw ideas and some tolerance for the literary expression, and not only. Paradoxically, those dissidents who arranged themselves against the official ideas and aesthetic principles of the socialist realism, instead of being imprisoned, were threatened with expulsion out of their countries. Except the Stalinian period of dictatorship, the later period was milder and more clement for the artists who felt that they had something bigger and more important to say than the things permitted and recommended did. By comparison with the state of things in Albania, this kind of dissidence and this kind of tolerance never touched our world of art and their artists. Since the outset of the 60s, for reasons that cannot be arranged here, Albania was a country that started its gradually segregation from the rest of the world and finished up as the most miserable, isolated country in the middle of Europe. The Western world was keeping silent and somehow looked to help with its indifference the regime to carry out its destructive work within a society which was young, only just 50 years, having its own independent state. The tradition and the traditional people who saw the stream of an organic literature being interrupted in such a way experienced a kind of cultural despair, in italics, which first of all is marked by an unmatching of aesthetic tastes. This despair has touched not only the tendencies which were about to bring the novelties and which had no energy to break apart the taboos, but it has touched the official literature, the official writers, the tops of the hierarchy as well. The being engaged in the organisms of the dictatorship has great pragmatic advantages, perhaps even this of the perfection of a personal art, but it obliged many artists with proved possibilities in creation to pay a high moral and realizing ransom. This caused the big crisis after communism among us, leaving the art creators without the binary title of missionary and visionary. Big part of the ex-writers of socialist realism were obliged to seek for an alibi, or worse, even to invent it. I think that as long as they are alive, they may use their authority as well as this kind of inertia of this moral power they got in the cunning partnership with a kind of state which hated its own citizens. But the participation of some has caused the non-participation of some others. This wouldn't occur through a contest or through a confrontation of skills and talents. The state muse, after all, had suffocated every kind of different artistic expression. The official art of the period aimed, except the spiritual castration of the real man, but even every hint of anthropocentrist art. I think that the other literature has been developed not only without the permission of the political order in Albania, but absolutely in a total counterpoint with the official literature of this period. Here I see the delay, or better, the hesitation for the acknowledgement of the dissidents among us, the theories about so-called dissidences of abroad, as well as the incompatibility of their adoption in the Albanian literary landscape. Someone else, even he culturally despairs, runs enthusiastically to name the underground artists together with their products as a drawer literature, a term which is not at all suitable, but moreover, somehow depreciatory. Who were generally the official writers that embraced successfully or non-successfully the principles of the official literature of socialist realism? Obviously, Albania had writers which had made a brilliant career in the period before the World War II. Some of them tried to be conformed with the new directives in art, but they failed and then emerged in a total silence. There were others, younger than the former, who adopted themselves somehow and arrived to be prominent names among the officials. But a big success was known only by individuals that grew up with a regime and were educated in the schools of communist system inside and abroad. Generally, the group of the writers grown with the regime were from the countryside. Living in the countryside was very, very hard because of the primitive methods that ruled in the sector of agriculture. Families encouraged their children to study in the schools in order they never come back to their village of origin. They made a lot of sacrifices to make it possible that their children be educated in the public schools. They taught them to be obedient, to be versatile and flexible, to have no principles, and to go always in the direction the wind flows. Perhaps this is the profile of the second generation of writers, which didn't come from the rows of the partisan army. The last ones began after the war with the new lines of the new art among us. The criteria to choose them were only political ones. They were promoted in art only because they had written during the war some song texts or some satirical poems. This generation of art makers was not so fortunate, and today nobody mentions them at all. Who were the authors who, in quite prohibitive conditions, hiding their writings and without a hope of publishing them, kept them at home with a high risk of being discovered, which meant to them first of all prison, and in accordance with the content of their works, maybe they ran the risk of being put to death, as really happened to Jajika, Nela, Bloshmi, and Leka, the four writers who have been executed.
Mr. Shakov,
somehow,
can I just say we're coming on 15 minutes, so if you could come towards a conclusion.
Yes, I have only 10 lines, if you permit.
Great, absolutely, of course.
Yeah. Somehow the other literature was written by people who belonged to highly sensitive cultural and aesthetic milieus, who worshipped the organic tradition and saw in it the possibility of multiple contacts with the Albanian literature could have or already had with the best European contemporary literature. In a way or in another, they were aware that the great results of modernism or postmodernism, even if the country was totally closed and the circulation of good books was severely kept watch over. Also, we have to mention that the refusal was not only against the aesthetic structure of this art, but after 1972, when the regime built a standard language for all the nation, for his needs of strengthening power and hegemony, the authors, the writers we are dealing with refused this lingual fabrication and continued to write in the Northern literary expression in Gaelic. That was all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. As I often say in these Zoom events, this is my least favorite moment of Zoom is when the silence is deafening, where usually there would be thunderous applause. Congratulations on the book, which sounds fascinating. And thank you very much for giving us this basis for our discussion, which will be very helpful, I think, for today. We'll continue, and just to say in advance that as you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll bring them to the speakers after they've all had a chance to make their presentations. But you should feel free to post your questions at any time. We'll continue now with Lulieta Leșanacu, who's an Albanian poet. She studied Albanian philology and literature at the University of Tirana, where she is right now, as is Primo Shlaku, and later graduated with an MFA from Warren Wilson College in the USA. She attended the prestigious International Writing Program at the University of Iowa in 1999 and was awarded a Writer's Fellowship from the Black Mountain Institute at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in 2008-2009. She's the author of 9 poetry collections in her language and 14 other collections published in translation in other languages. 5 of her books in translation are published in English. Her last poetry collection in English is Negative Space, published by New Directions in the USA and Blood Axe Books in the UK, which was a winner of the English Pen Award, a finalist for the Griffin International Poetry Prize in 2019 in Canada, and a finalist for PEN America 2019. She's worked as a journalist, TV author, university lecturer, and a historical researcher, and today will present to us on her own work. And I welcome Lulieta Leșanacu.
Thank you. So as is announced, my speech is about the challenges I had to face as a writer when writing about communists, illustrated time to time with some lines from my poems. The widely known statement of Theodor Adorno that after Auschwitz, it is barbaric to write poetry may be the same true about communism, considering the tyranny that communist regimes unleashed upon the world. According to the Black Book of Communism, the number of victims, including deaths through execution, man-made hunger, famine, war, deportation, and forced labor, amounts to more than 94 million. And much bigger is the number of political prisoners or internment and house arrest victims. But what Adorno meant with barbaric isn't exactly the role of poetry to release us from the pressure of the real, as well as Stevens suggests. You don't have a clear response about it until you try to write about communist horror yourself, undergoing a complex process where the creative imagination gets blocked out by the stubbornness of experiences bigger than life, therefore eclipsed by the power of moral, cultural, and philosophical reflection. As in Shakespeare drama, good and evil are an inseparable part of human nature. As a screenwriting teacher at the Film Academy, I advise my students, you can't understand the darkness without the presence of light, and vice versa. So the meaning of life and of any literary work as life's projection must consist in a kind of balance between these two, good and evil. But communism, as Nazis, produce only an escalation of evil or nuances of evil, and moreover of the evil that humans are capable to inflict on one another. Elie Wiesel thought that at Auschwitz, not only the man died, but the idea of man. It is exactly this aspect that forces us to confront deep moral questions about our civilization, to face existential questions, preferring the silence instead of speaking, as a lot of survivors did. I myself belong to post-communist generation of Albanian writers. Therefore, whatever I would write would be old news without the same impact it would have if written before the fall of regime. So I missed the chance of writing as a political act. The first question I did to myself was why I should write about communism now? And the response arrived many years later in some certain age and experience when I started struggling to figure out my identity, my roots, myself. And in this inner journey, I faced the painful truth that much of identity forced open me, is forced open us as community, erasing the personal narratives and replacing them with a dark collective memory. Even the happiest moments in my life are not private at all. The fall of dictator statue, for example, a political moment, is the same memorable for other 100,000 people. In the poem Negative Space, it was exactly the creative process itself which brought me to this idea, since it started as biographical poem with biographical and lyrical elements, but gradually it evoked stories and moments that belong to everyone, to a whole generation. And failing to personalize the narrative, first person singular gradually became the first person plural, us. This argument is elaborated further on another poem titled They Hasten to Die. I'm just giving a few lines of that. They are dying one after the other. Shoveling earth on them has become as common as sprinkling salt on food. They are all the same generation, my people, or more accurately, of an era. And the children of an era are like dogs tied to a sled in their search for gold. They either run together or fall together. Another hint in this poem is the suppression of individuality. From the viewpoint of Marxist doctrine, the individual was a negligible thing in the eyes of the nation. So the only way to survive under communist regime was to become invisible. One of my poems, Negative Space, evokes absences, emptiness, what was unseen, unspoken, or undone. Based on this visual art concept of negative space, where the space around objects, but not the objects themselves, become the real and most significant part of an image, I meant that it was exactly the emptiness, the lack of action, the passive resistance that shaped us and so our choices. But it is completely something different writing about horrors of communism. My long time hesitation had to do not with my skepticism that poems are product of large historical forces, more than with the fear that after the memoirs of survivors from prisons and labor camps published after the collapse of the regime, nothing was left to say and to write about. And overall, I am a second-hand witness. My family members were imprisoned, deported, executed, but not I. Something which complicated even more the situation. But my disadvantage could turn into advantage on some other aspects. The first, for the witness, the loyalty to experience is an ethical issue that narrows the space of imagination and creative playfulness. And the second, this powerful dependence to the real facts influences even the narrator's emotional attitude. So let's say I was more independent, but what I needed now was a perspective, a new, original approach. Such a perspective might be found on a long poem, Water and Carbon, in the form of confrontation of materialism view, according to which everything is a physical object composed by protons, electrons, water, and carbon, with the view of a man as a moral being. or to prove what Viktor Frankl observes, that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Now, here are some lines from the poem. There was so much dignity in the body of the old man who hung himself, rejected here on earth and now also in heaven. In his bare feet, like a saint's, his body a frozen planet, revolving one last time around itself, in his head dropping to the side, as if he were refusing to witness even his own death. But it didn't end here. They plucked his gold teeth with such disgrace as if they were plucking 3 generations. Declassed, even among the dead. How could a toothless man protect himself on the last judgment? How would he formulate his arguments? The dead will laugh, angels will crack up. The poem is composed by different parts, each part a different experience and poetical argument. When the historical writing employs imaginative techniques, the effect may be questionable. So from one piece to another, by offering arguments that opposite each other, I not only hide my judgment and create a neutral voice, but I also encourage, I missed the text. But I also encourage an analytical rather than historical reading of the text, as here. Another illustration. But when I saw the former Sorbonne professor secretly digging through trash for a piece of watermelon rind, which he whipped on his pants, then swallowed whole without chewing, I witnessed 5,000 years of civilization gone and extinct in a minute. And finally, how such memories can be copied into words, language, poetry. What devices, strategies, techniques are available to render message understandable, comprehensible, impressing. As Primo Levi seeks to explain, just as our hunger is not that feeling of missing a meal, so our way of being cold has need of a new word. We say hunger, we say tiredness, fear, pain, we say winter, and they are different things. They are free words created and used by free men who lived in comfort and suffering in their homes. So after Holocaust, a new language should be invented. This challenge becomes even more difficult considering poetry and its vertical reading. For example, how to use these common words in poetry, including the word suffer itself, in order for the reader to experience the same psychological state in which the character finds himself. Employing these familiar words in metaphors and allegories provide a new picture that helps others enter this world. Then another illustration. Then one day you become one with suffering. Suffering transforms into a limb, which you must treat generously like the other limbs. Wash it, clean it, cut its nails carefully, keep it warm, feel its numbness, like the tarm you place under your head late at night, dumping on it all your sleepless weight. Another advantage is the art's capacity to communicate to the reader on a personal level, and in this way, a rising level of empathy that can't be reached through the documentary literature. So we have to build intimacy with the reader. Then you become one with suffering, another. For example, so the poem is, sorry, because my computer is really giving me a hard time. In 2 or 3 parts of the poem, I personalize the story, becoming a character myself, but intimacy doesn't have to do with a narrative voice more than with the originality and vitality of images and details. And the ones that never betray you are those images and details that belong to your personal visual memory, as in this poem. Due to instincts, some of us returned home alive with a pair of borrowed shoes, and we bore children, 2-dimensional children. daydreaming children, the children of survival, who noticed only the bony haunches of the farm oxen, and at night, like a secret sect, gathered around Dickens. Indeed, this is a confession. I was one of those survivors' children growing up with Dickens novels under my pillow, an object with which you can make 100 associations and in different levels. In this long poem, I have involved different communication styles, dialogue, colloquial, and conversational diction, which when used appropriately can be helpful in creating a connection between the reader and the writer and make it easier for the reader to agree with the writer's point of view. Extremely helpful in my case had been my experience of interviewing the survivors, one of my duties as a researcher at the Institute for the Study of Crimes of Communism. This experience provided me not only with information and unique details that are widely involved in this poem, but also with a ready dramatic structure. I could see that confession is a result of a natural psycho-emotional selection process of experience that occurs within each individual. So borrowing the dramatic structure of their narration in my poetry was exactly what Aristotle suggests about art as imitation of rhythm of nature. For example, theoretically, it is difficult to explain why the moment of release from internment after 47 years for someone is more shocking than many other stories occurred within this time frame. But I feel that there is something unmistakable in this confession structure. His emphasis of this moment through intonation, long silences between phrases, photograph details, sighs, in a way that I, as his audience, perceive as the climax of his narrative. And my poem, Water and Carbon, ends exactly with this episode. The character who never left his internment village, at the first moment he is declared a free man, takes a train and goes to see the sea for the first time in his life. To close with some lines of the poem. You are free, they told him, after 47 years. Where'll you go? It was the same as asking him somehow on death row, what song do you want to hear? Or better, do you know what you have lost? And here is the sea. How can man hide such miracle from man? How can you hide water from water? Where had he seen that white ship departing from the dock? In the dreams of the father, grandfather, great-grandfather? Around him circled men and women in speckled bathing suits and joyous children with sunburned shoulders. He alone in the wrong season, late, premature. He alone, fully clothed, head to toe, like a black piano closed in the corner of a hall, around which the world revolves undisturbed. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That's a beautiful place to end, and quite an image, a person like a black piano. Thank you for sharing those remarks and that insight into your concerns in your own work, which I'm sure there will be questions about. We have a couple questions already in the Q&A, and please feel free to continue to add them. But let me introduce our third and final speaker, who is Lisandri Kola, an author, a scholar, and a translator. He has taught Albanian literature and exile. He's taught Albanian literature of exile here at the University of Michigan in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, and Albanian modern literature, the history of the Albanian sonnet, translation studies and comparative literature at the University of Tirana. Kola is the author of many books, among them A Poem of Love in Albanian, English, and Serbian, Butterflies Die in May, Sonnets, and Saga of a Day, among many others. He has translated into Albanian language Longinus, Alda Marini, Fernando Pessoa, Luigi Pirandello, St. Anthony of Padua, and has in progress Rhyme of Guido Cavalcanti. Selected poetry and prose of Kola are translated into Montenegrin, English, German, and French. He was awarded the Albanian National Prize in Poetry in 2014 and obtained a PhD from the University of Tirana in 2014. Welcome, Lisandri Kola.
Thank you, Professor Molke, and thank you to Chris and the Albanian American Students Organization for having us today in this panel. I will try to share a few slides for the audience. This talk aims to synthesize the Albanian literary process under a quasi-5 decennium of dictatorship, to summarize some aspects in which the totalitarian system of Enver Hoxha was founded, and to confront the socialist realism with Albanian prison literature and Albanian literature of exile. My arguments have in focus the decadence of memory culture in the Albanian post-communism, the fragility of the institutions to distance themselves with the former regime, and the 30 years tentative of Albanian transition to a functional democracy, which might be considered as a moderate prolongation of communism. Therefore, I will try to briefly introduce an underrepresented culture whose martyrdom, if is not confessed today, risks being forgotten tomorrow. The Albanian communists, known as Communist Party of Albania, later changed in the Labour Party of Albania, and after the 19th, in Socialist Party of Albania, a party which currently rules the country. Firstly seized power by the end of 1944 after the German troops left Albania. The literature and the arts, of course, became a central part of the Albanian communist program, which immediately contextualized them in political axioms. The historical cultural harmony between the two main dialects, Geg, spoken in northern Albania, Kosovo, and partially Montenegro and North Macedonia, and Tosk dialect, spoken in southern Albania, was subverted by ideological perspectives of Hoxha's rule. According to several scholars, the process of the Albanian unified language started in 1948 and ended up arbitrarily in 1972, based circa 90% in Tosk dialect. Meanwhile, the Geg dialect, with a long written tradition over 5 centuries and simultaneously a literary koine, was considered by Politburo and Albania Stalinist linguists as glottophobia, withdrawing the two orthographic resolutions, that of the Shkodër Literary Committee of 1916 and the Orthography of Albanian Language of Pristina, 1964. The first one decided that Geg variant of Elbasan would be the Albanian standard language, despite the indisputable authority of the literary and the linguist tradition of Shkodër, a primary cultural city upon the communist arrival. While the second orthography was a revised examination of the literary committee and embodied by language updates. The latter, it was consensual codification by 3 Albanian communities, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Macedonia, who were under the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Surprisingly, the decision of 1972 was also approved by Albanians of Kosovo, which was criticized by scholars. In my view, it is crystal clear that the Albanian institution under Hoxha's regime lacked scientific criteria and monopolized the unification of Albania. The Orthography Congress of 1972, a poor epitome resemblance with the Albanian Alphabet Congress in 1908, was led politically, and up to now had inherited a 5-decade debate, which seems to be a deadlock for the academic future of Geg dialect. Currently, the official Albanian language is in a full stagnancy and a mummified process that opposes the nature of the language itself. Moreover, by intervening in an anatomical system and by impoverishing the normal progress of the language, Enverism practiced a cultural inner genocide, mostly against the Geg Catholic clergy, who were writers, lexicographers, linguists, translators, and so on, a majority of whom were executed, internally banished, sentenced, or persecuted. Obviously, the Albanian sickle and hammer oppressed any intellectual reaction by paradoxically naming it agitation and propaganda, and by burying those in secrecy with criminal tools and anti-human methods. The isolated Albania under the dictatorship might be compared with a massive grave, and the post-communism an amplifier of the victims' persecution, for whom did not even dig to gather their missing bones, neither to honor their memory. Consequently, the also called Albanian democracy, under the influence of misleading personalities today who contributed enormously to the former regime, has misshaped the collective memory and failed to recognize its sufferings. A likely language, the official literature, during Albanian totalitarianism was established under the ideological criteria of socialist realism. And as Archipipa states, it was a facsimile of Soviet Union's socialist realism. Among the long list of Albanian Stalinist hardliner writers and propagandists, the most representative of Albanian vox communismus is Ismail Kadare, recently the winner of Neustadt Prize and who is internationally known as one of the Nobel waiting list writers. With a career of almost 4 decades under the Albanian communism, Kadare has induced the critics to consider his controversial status sometimes as dissidence, sometimes as sycophancy, or as a symbiosis of both. If I may say, perhaps Kadare is a specimen of a flexible anti-conformist right. In an article translated and published here in Ann Arbor, Kadare considers, quote, the writer as a natural enemy of dictatorship, unquote, a claim that seems quite contradictory with his widely known rating in support of the dictatorship and Enver Hoxha. On one side, some critics argue that is a deceptive initiative to compare Kadare's phenomenon with other writers of Eastern Europe who experienced the communism, while some others argue, dissident or not, Kadare is one of the greatest writers in the world. I should point out that this writer is predominantly distinguished in communism rather than post-communism, including the Albanian literary system. After the 90s, in my modest opinion, the literature of Kadare can be considered less than average. Besides the socialist realism imprimatur, the Albanian literature produced its anti-conventional writers, in particular political prisoner writers, such is the case of the poet Archipipa, whom with his prison book is the founder of the Albanian prison literature. He was followed by others as Havzinela, Uran Kostreci, Amik Kasoruho, Visarjiti, etc., or the prison memories writers as Father Zefplumi, Konrad Jolaj, Simon Jubani, Zef Simoni, and Fatos Lubonia, Elchoba, and so on, who denounced the crimes of communism and confessed their experience in various prisons. Another category of poets who deny their own literary existence by not compromising their literary product with the ideologies of socialist realism, but consciously contributed to a silent literature are Zev Zorba, Muhammad Ademi, and Primož Laco, whose works remained unpublished until the fall of communism. In the post-communist Albania, those who refused the former realist socialism licentia, those who wrote them and maintained their manuscripts in absolute secrecy due to random controls of the houses, and which such an act by risking imprisonment or even execution today are shadowed by the troubadours of the communism, with political ties in post-communist parties. Same as in politics, Albanian literature after the 90s has no lustration. Does the Albanian literature under communism needs a process of lustration? referring to the frail academic institution, let me please to affirm with regret, this is already overdue. As a pure literary dissidence, in the sense that Homo poeticus conflates with Homo politicus, I shall consider the poems of Archipipa and Havzinela. Pipa spent 10 years in Hoxha's prisons, where he wrote his poems in tobacco papers adapting minuscule handwriting. Being a political prisoner during the Albania communism meant that one must survive the forced labor, the mines, the digs, the swamps, the absence of food, the police tortures, the violence, the miserable conditions, and the tragedies and persecution of their families outside. Not in a few cases, the last mentioned was worse than the prisoner's destiny. The writers behind the bars under Hoxha's draconic rule had no chance doing yoga, neither having a typewriter, neither talking for cars, or neither asking their relatives to bring in prison's abundance of food and drinks. They literally starved for the piece of bread, and this statement does not carry any sort of exaggeration. After setting free, Archipipa with his sister Fehime fled Albania by swimming across the Lake of Shkodër to Montenegro. The prison book, it has tobacco papers, were stitched in Archie's jacket and brought to the US. And in 1959, he published the book in Rome. Thereafter, he dedicated his academic life to Albanian, Italian, and French studies, and also advocated for human rights and denounced Albanian enverism. Havzinela, after spending years in prison in 1988, a year before the fall of Berlin's Wall, was hanged and buried inside a hole of an electric pole. His poetic inheritance consists of 7 notebooks written in prison and published integrally only in 2018. Nela's poems are influenced by the Albanian folk verse, where he demonstrates his contraposition with the regime. So far, Nela's death, along with that of poets Genci Leka and Wilson Bloshmi, was primarily caused by intelligentsia who collaborated with the regime, and yet some of them are part of cultural institutions today. Albanian literature, deprived by morpho-ideological archetypes from 1944 to 91, was developed exceptionally in diaspora. With the exiled authors, it is important to emphasize that the Albanian exile has been constituted by escaping the borders. The absurd isolation of Hoxha's regime did not allow any form of country leave or expulsion. The panorama of the exiled authors, yet untreated by Albanian critics and foreign scholars, is omnifarious and similar to the East European exiled writers in many cases. The exiled writers were mainly located in the US, Italy, and Germany. In the latter resided the greatest Albanian poet Martin Camaj, escaped in 1948. Due to the limited time, I will focus only in a few outlines over Camaj's work, who is the antipode of the Albanian socialist realism writers. For Camaj, the Albanian state does not lobby any abroad critic apparatus or editorial affiliations, as might happen, for instance, with Kadare since the 70s up to now. Furthermore, Camaj's work was censored until the 90s and classified among many others as enemies of the government. In Rose, in Albania, Drania, an unconventional corpus of madrigals, he portrays himself as a segregate persona poetica, who lived with and within his literature. As a linguist by profession, his main preoccupation is the aesthetic evaluation of the language. Also, the traditional deconstruction of the verse, stereotype over the literary system, prosody, allegory, stilistics, narrative norms, abstraction, anthropocentrism, and so on. Characteristics that are matchless with the proletariat and the idealization, of the communist life. In closing, if Albanian society does not reflect on the cruelty and oppression of the former regime and continues to recycle the socialist realism writers, yet not fully detached from that tradition, this culture will deny the crucial literary system survived from the collective hysteria that supported a dictatorship. Otherwise, it will place an embargo both on Albanian literature of exile and prison literature, with which the academic community abroad needs to be introduced ever since. Thank you for your attention. And I am very open for any question you might have or comment or suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisandri Kola. And thank you, all three of you, for doing exactly what Lisandri ended on, which is bringing to our attention these important questions. And I want to acknowledge also that you're doing so in English. In other words, that you're all three of you doing some translation work for us simply by joining us in English. We always take it for granted, but I want to say that we don't. And that with the translation work that you're doing, whether it's between languages, which I understand all of you are involved in, or between, as Lulieta was saying, between experience and poetry and poetic expression, that the work you're doing seems extremely important to me. And I'm very grateful that you're here to share it with us and teach us. I have to confess, I know personally, certainly a lot less than some of the questions that you'll receive from the audience. And although I'd heard about this language policy before, I hadn't thought it through in the way that you just very briefly alluded to. So it seems to me like questions of language and translation are crucially on the table for our discussion today. But I will take the questions that we received in order, even though it seems to me like the first one, which came in after Primo Shlaku had given his remarks, was in a way answered by Lisandri Kola. I will read it though, so that Primo gets a chance to weigh in, because it's about the role of Ismail Kadare. I don't know Albanian, but I assume this means thank you, Përshëndetje, something like that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for speaking today and sharing your ideas and perspective. My name is Teuta Zeneli, and I'm an undergraduate student on the board of the Albanian Student Association organization. I have a question for Professor Shlaku. How do you think the literary work of Ismail Kadare fit into an Albanian society that was so censored? And how do you think this Albanian literature influences post-communist Albanian society today?
Good. Well, we have different opinions about this author, this writer, and I would say that the Albanian society is divided in two parts, which think not the same thing, and that think the opposite things about this. Good. I have a firm idea that he is and he was a writer of a race of birth. He got talent from the day he was conceived in the womb of his mother. But I would say he came in this world in the wrong moment and in the wrong time. That's why he a very hard ransom to the dictatorship and to the future of Albanian literature, because now in this moment we're speaking, I think nobody is to know what happened during the Cold War with the communist leadership and the Russian leadership during the Cold War. There are things that have not to do with a man, with a human being, have with the politics. I think he is one of those writers who was born together with and has grown up together with a dictatorship, and that's why he is not so sensitive to have other ideas. Even after the fall of communism, he has not made a detour in his work. Some criticism say that after the fall of dictatorship, he hasn't written anymore. He has no more this. He is not in his prime of the years of the 60s and 70s, and so I think that Kadare, willing or not, has served the dictatorship.
So
And now I think he is ruling over the landscape of literature with his shadow, not with his presence. And the faster Albanian culture puts him in the place that belongs to him, really belongs to him, and keeps not him as a genius, as a personality for all the times of Albanian times. I think we have we are still under the mushroom of the dictatorship, and this dictatorship is going on and is still with us, making shadow and leaving us not to see the real and directly the sun with our eyes.
I think that became clear from all the three presentations. If I heard correctly, Lisandre, you called Kadare a flexible anti-conformist writer. I just wanted to give you a chance to respond, but also to Lulieta to see if she wants to add anything to this discussion before we move to the next question.
He has been a conformist. He has been because there is a contradiction. I think every writer has to be judged in his own country, then to be judged outside. He has been judged positively in France or in the Western Europe,
Primo,
but not.
The question was.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting, dear Primo, but the question was actually for me and Lulieta if she has anything to add on it.
Yes. He hasn't been affirmed in the Albanian society because his collaboration with the socialist society and the leadership, and even with the dictator himself, is evident, and nobody has to say. For example, his novel, the Winter of the Loneliness. We see the dictator to be a messiah.
Let's let Lisandre and Lulieta also chime in on this.
Good.
Thank you, Professor von Moltke. Yeah, actually, I, let's say, gave an epitome or paradigm as a flexible anti-conformist writer, having on the table all the opinions of the scholars. What is the case of Kadare? Sometimes scholars claim that Kadare was a dissident, not a political dissident, but dissident by language. And here is the point to confront the opinions with the Albanian tradition critic. But the case of Kadare, for the Albanian researchers and scholars, is clear enough, I think, because he is, let's say, popular with the works during the communism rather than the works after the post-communism. But the question of Kadare is something related to the Albanian institutions, I think, just to lobby. He has more than 15 or 60 years that he is, let's say, on the market writers, if I say so, because is the exceptional case that a writer in a harsh dictatorship, as the case of Kadare, if we compare with Boris Pasternak, for example, or Alexander Solzhenitsyn, they were not allowed by countries to have international reputation. So he, as many scholars claims, had been, let's say, kind of flexible to the regime, but it is something up to him. And for me, he is the most vox communism representative, I think. So.
Lulieta, do you want to weigh in on this, or you can also pass? In which case, there's a question for you in the chat that I would. If you want a different question, you're still muted. We can't hear you.
Just a very short. I read something very short. Is that different from us? The work of Kadare is widely published all around the world and in different languages. So. Everybody can judge, about the work of Kadare, like everybody in this presentation too, because in one side you have the history of communism, on the other side you have the books of Kadare. So everybody can judge in their way. But what I should add is that to judge about Kadare or other writers' literature from this perspective, at first you should know very well the process of the censorship and self-censorship in Albania, and why it was so difficult to write dissident literature before the regime collapsed, when being in Albania and living in Albania, how you could survive. And that's why you have that underground literature, which now we can call dissident literature, but it's not exactly that the traditional dissident literature, considering the other Eastern countries, Eastern European countries. But what I wanted to add about Kadare else is that I think that Kadare found a way to survive. He used historical topics to avoid as much as possible the process of censorship and self-censorship. I think this was a smart gesture to escape as much as possible. I am not saying that he could escape, but to escape as much as possible to this and not to write that, to write a literature that can survive most of that, to the time.
Yeah, great. There's all of you are starting to talk or have been talking about comparisons that might be made in different ways to other socialist and post-socialist countries. And there's a question about that, but before I get that, that'll be my last question. Before I get there, Teuta Tseneli, who is also with a student organization, has a question for Lulieta. First, thank you for speaking today. The poem is beautiful. I put a link in the chat to Water and Carbon. I'm interested about the shared experience of trauma that affects an afflicted community. For a younger generation who did not see the suffering firsthand or do not have an intimate connection with these experiences, do you think the remnants of the trauma persist by virtue of being in the community?
Well, now I can speak from two different positions, as a writer and also as a researcher in the Institute of Study of the Crimes of Communism in Albania. The situation is so that the education about communism in Albanian schools is still very poor. So especially the new generation is little informed or not informed at all about the crimes of communism. This is a post-communist situation in Albania. The question is that not only in Albania, but in some other Eastern European countries, ex-communist countries, now let's say they are fed up with writing about communism. I had a friend of mine who is Polish told me that Polish publishers don't want to hear anymore about that. They are not interested to publish literature about that. But on the other side, the Western audiences, the Western countries are not informed or a little bit or not informed at all about that. For example, to me, it sounds ridiculous hearing during the American elections using the word, epithet communist, because it means that you know nothing about communists. How you can call Bernie Sanders communist? So it's exactly that you can feel that they don't know what communism was. So let's say there is still much more interest about literature which comes from ex-communist countries in Western countries, from Western publishers than in East countries. And we are, let's say, what we are doing, we are trying to combine as institute education policies with cultural projects, with new generations. We can do what we can, but the situation with literature is it is as it is.
Thank you. So I would like to give each of you a chance to say some concluding remarks because we're coming up on time. But I want to note first that Alexandra Luca says she's president of AASO and doesn't have a question, but just wants to thank you all for speaking today. So I wanted to convey that. The other questions seem to me to coalesce around this question of how Albania compares to the other socialist and post-socialist countries. And I'll read one of the questions and then add a thought of my own and invite you to speak for a couple minutes to conclude. So the question from Lidiona Shaholari is, thank you so much for these great talks. Shum falaminderit. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, thank you.
My questions are, how can we understand Albanian dissident literature in conversation with other socialist dissident literature at this time? Or perhaps dissident and exile literature more broadly? Who were Albanian dissident poets and writers in conversation with outside of Albania? And I feel like you've started answering this question, but maybe there's room to expand. And the one addition that I wanted to make to that is that we had a very interesting lecture in this same lecture series in the fall by my colleague Benjamin Paloff, who talked about dissident writers like Solzhenitsyn and Olga Tokarczuk and a few others, and made the point that in the West, there's a danger that the dissident writers become only spokespeople for a moral authority against communism, and aren't quite read anymore for what they do aesthetically. So their work disappears behind the moral imperative. And B, don't quite get in touch with what's going on in their host countries. So he was saying, how is it that they then don't pick up the question of race in the United States when they're in exile there? So that's a question that goes beyond what you asked. But I'm curious how you would think about, the history that you all are involved in bringing out and sharing with us, how it plays out in a broader international and transnational context. And if you'd like to add anything else, please feel free to do so. And I'd like to give each of you a couple minutes to respond or make some concluding remarks, maybe in the order in which you spoke. So I'd ask Primo Shlaku first.
Yeah, just as I said in my speech, the attention of the West was not equal over all the countries of the Eastern Bloc. Albania has, that's my opinion, has taken the less of this attention, because Albania is a small country, even if it has a geographical position very, very good and very strategic, if you want. But Albania has been given always like a rest. So Yugoslavia in Yalta has been given 50-50, and Albania was given 50-50. So we went, after the end of the war, we went with Yugoslavia. Then things have changed. I am aware, and I am conscious that things in Albania, or the dissidence in Albania, was not of the extent as the Russian or the Czech or Czechoslovak or Romanian or Hungarian was. Albania, the political leadership took Albania on its shoulder and took it away to China. So there was an effort to take off Albania from Europe, to de-Europeanize Albania, and to take and to bring it with to China. And so we lost 2 decades in this divine love with the Mao Zedong and the Chinese leadership. Then we broke with them. We have the phenomena in Albania, in literature of Albania, are not of the same greatness and extent and importance as the Russian ones, because the eyes of the West were put on Russia, because Russia was the mother of all the evil in all this history after the WW2. So I want to say we would be ashamed, we as Albanians, if we had not some people, some strong people, some men who wouldn't make that what they did during this. They opposed a resistance, a pressure to all the situation, which was dramatic as far as it concerns the human rights. So we have played all we that have written and kept in secret all our writing. We have played with our neck, with our families, with our future, and I don't know. It was we were so cowards. So cowards, I want to admit it, that we could be saved.
Thank you.
Cowardice sometimes is a good virtue.
Yeah. Thank you. Lulieta, any concluding remarks, please?
But please, just what was exactly the question? Just shortly.
The question was, I mean, you should feel free to pick up on any thread that you think is important at this point. The question was about the relationship of Albania to the broader socialist and Western contexts.
So Albania, the communism in Albania was one of the cruelest forms compared with communism of Soviet Union during Stalin regime. and with Pol Pot of Cambodia, Pol Pot regime. So it was really cruel. Albania was one of the most isolated countries, probably the first one, even among the ex-communist countries. So being an very isolated country, being the oppression, political oppression was, as I told you before, only compared with Stalinist oppression. So it was, we necessarily needed some kind of dissidence. We had to, but because of, I think, well, I listened very carefully to my colleagues, and I have my own doubts that dissidence is, in my opinion, is an intentional act of resisting against the regime, and not because we didn't have such, let's say, courageous artists and people to do that, but pressure was extraordinary. And I think the Secret Service and all these, let's say, political mechanisms destroyed in the embryo all the tryings to create some form of dissidence, as I understand dissidence, kind of organized and intentional act. But did we have other forms of resistance? I could call that passive resistance. Yes, they wrote, and didn't distribute. We couldn't even have those forms of samizdats. The samizdat form didn't exist in Albania because that, let's say, conspiracy system and the surveying system was one of the, let's say, most, compared with Stalinist one. So it was impossible. It was totally impossible. Artists were imprisoned not for things they did, but they were imprisoned just because their personality was kind of let's say, infectious for the others. They have more personality, not because their art was a kind of dissidence, because they didn't let them that alone. So it was kind of, let's say, they were doing that to how to prevent. They did everything to prevent this kind of, let's say, dissidence in Albania. Of course, we have writer dissidents who could escape Albania. They were in exile. And we have ex-prisoners who could write in prison and try to memorize their poems, and they could write them back when they were out of the prison. But this kind of dissidence, but not that we find, for example, in Czechoslovakia or in Poland, for example. There were a generation of poets. So that's what I only to add about.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the last word goes to Lisandri Kola.
Thank you, Professor von Moltke. The problem with comparing Albanian dissidents literature with other literature in Eastern Europe, for example, is a huge topic, and we don't have the chance today to examine all that problem related on. But I argue with Lulieta because we have dissidence literature as a case of Archipipa. I recall that fact, a political prisoner as Archipipa has directly imprisonment because he's confronts with the regime, with his ideas and his literary content on it. So if we read the poems of Havzinela, they are totally against the regime. So if we read the poems with the case of the murder of the former Prime Minister Mehmet Sheo of Albania, who is totally a poem against the realist socialism and other facts. So in Albania has survived a dissidence in literature, but comparing, unfortunately, it is not translated in English on other European languages. And we don't have really, up to now, the chance to compare exactly. But if we compare the poems of Martin Samai, they are translated in English. His poems and his work are comparable with the Russian exiled authors because he didn't switch the language as many others had done. And the case of Archie Pipa, if we recall his act at University of Berkeley with his students for free speech movement. So he understand his position, a kind of moral authority to relate your question and your definition about the colleague Benjamin Palov. But the dissidence in Albania is a process, is a working process, if I would say so, because we need to see more deeply on the typology of this dissidence. So it is political language, and there are something similar cases mixed up, and in this moment I can definitely comes out with a clear definition. So,
but I do want to thank you all for I mean, in effect, this is what we have done over the last hour and a half, is to start to complicate these issues especially for those of us who come to this not as experts as you are, but with an intense interest. So I'm very, very grateful for the contributions you've made and how you've helped us open up these questions in all their complexity. If we were in person, I would ask for another round of applause. You just have to imagine the applause now. And I am going to close with a couple of announcements quickly to tell people that next week on Tuesday at 4 p.m. we'll be co-sponsoring a very interesting looking talk called Opposition to Nazi Rule in Experience and Memory with Mark Roseman from the University of Indiana. This will be on our events page. And then Thursday next week, Jascha Reichart will speak on the Temersons and the art of translation, which we're doing together with the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. And we have another very interesting event that we'll post very soon with a Hungarian member of parliament about autocracy in Poland and Hungary that I look forward to very much. And last, finally, I'll make a quick pitch in case you would like to support our work, especially on Albanian issues. We have an Albanian Community Summer Fellowship Initiative that offers summer funding inside our center, summer funding to undergraduate students from a wide spectrum of disciplines of study who can conduct research and pursue internships in Albania and neighboring countries. So we encourage the students to be on the lookout for that, and those who can, we encourage to help us make that possible with their donations if you're able. But again, I want to close with a big, big thank you to our three panelists, Primož Laku, Luljeta Lishanaku, and Lisandri Kola. We were very privileged to have you here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Podmolke.
Bye-bye.